Okay, so trying to manage your time while you're online learning, remote learning. Um, if you watched the workday video or the time and space video, I talked about trying to carve out a chunk of time each day that you can designate as your work time. And that is, I think, the best situation if you can do it. But a lot of people, it just doesn't work out for whatever reason. And so you can also think about trying to get your work done in intervals, which might be a little bit more flexible and give you ways of adapting um, when you're getting your work done. So, what I mean by intervals is just relatively short chunks of time. So instead of trying to do everything all at once, right? So that blob representing, you know, several hours in a particular day, um, it's often easier to manage trying to work on things in smaller chunks, right? So to work on one thing, work on another thing, maybe work on the first thing again, maybe work on a third thing, instead of just one thing for a really, really long time, especially if you are taking multiple classes, which most people do. You're not just doing one thing, you're doing multiple things. And so if you're able to switch between things, often you can be more efficient and more balanced. Okay. So, a couple of things to be aware of that people run into. There are a couple of cognitive biases that we are all prone to that make it difficult for us to manage our workflow and to manage our time. And two of them to be aware of, there's one called unit bias and there's one called the planning fallacy. Okay. Unit bias is our tendency to want to just deal with one thing all at once, to want to finish something before moving on to another thing. And it's just sort of the way most human beings are, to want to deal with one thing before moving on because maybe there's a nagging feeling that this is still hanging around and I haven't quite finished it. Or I want to simplify things by getting things out of the way. That's often how people think of things. I want to get all this stuff out of the way and then I can focus on something else. But what ends up happening is you run into the planning fallacy. So these two things sort of mutually support each other and mutually sort of mess us up when it comes to getting work done and managing our time. And so what happens is, let's say you have a bunch of different things you want to or need to do, A, B, C, D, etc. Right. So unit bias is making us want to finish thing A first before moving on to thing B. And so we estimate that thing A will take a certain amount of time, an hour or whatever. But what the planning fallacy says is that things always take longer. We as human beings just always underestimate how long things take. It's a weird phenomenon. Some time management stuff out there, they'll say, okay, estimate how long it'll take and then double it. And weirdly, what happens is it'll still take longer, right? And so you think thing A will take this long, but it will always take that long. And then you start on thing B and you think it will take that long, and then it takes that long. And before you know it, it's 3 o'clock in the morning and you haven't even gotten started on thing C or thing D. And let's say thing D is actually the big important thing that you were going to get to, and you were trying to get all these smaller things out of the way, but they took way longer. And now it's the middle of the night and you're not going to sleep. So being aware of these things, I think, is important. Usually people blame themselves for these things. They think, oh, I'm just too slow, or I'm too distractible, or things came up and I didn't plan it right. But just to realize that it's actually these normal cognitive biases that all human beings have to deal with, and that's what's doing it. It's not your fault. Okay, so knowing about that, then I think hopefully can give you a little bit more of a reason, a little bit more incentive to try and work in intervals. And like I said, all I mean by an interval is a certain chunk of time. And I usually tell people anywhere between 10 minutes and an hour. If you've heard of the Pomodoro Technique, it is exactly this. They call them Pomodoros. The Pomodoro is a 25-minute unit and then a 5-minute break. And this is how you organize your workflow, is in these 25-minute units. I think that it's actually good to experiment with different chunks of time. My 10 to 60 minutes is kind of an arbitrary thing, but I think it's actually very interesting to try and experiment with doing things for 10, 15, 20 minutes instead of working on one thing for hours, which is often what people do. And that's the unit bias and the planning fallacy. And so if I can work in intervals and work on one thing for a while, not trying to finish it, just working on it for a predetermined chunk of time, and then I work on another thing for a predetermined chunk of time, and then switch back to the first thing or move on to a third thing. What's really good about this is that it's much easier to plan, because when you plan to finish one thing and then finish another thing and then finish another thing, you are always guaranteed 100% of the time going to be behind. And so if you always feel as if you're behind and you think it's something you're doing wrong, it is as simple as the fact that you're trying to finish one thing before moving on to another. And so the intervals can really help you manage your workflow much easier. And if you think about it, this is how school is organized. This is how work is organized. You have class for a certain amount of time. You have a meeting for a certain amount of time. You stick a few of these in the day, and that way you're managing or dealing with multiple things in a particular day. Okay. So it's a good thing to shoot for, trying to work on 2, 3, or even 4 of your classes every day, as opposed to what often people do is they just work on one thing. And so whatever's due the next day, that's the thing they work on. And you're always working to deadline and you're always feeling like you're behind. Okay. And so also intervals can help you deal with other things that are going on in your day, right? You might have a meal at some point. You might be wanting to get some exercise at some point. You might have chores or work. I'll just say chores or other things that you have to fit in the day. But then you might have times in the day where you have available time, and maybe you can fit in an interval of one thing and an interval of another thing. You know, if you have something, even if it's as short as 1 hour, you could potentially fit in 2 different things, at least to be moving things forward. Little chunks of time in between other things, 10 minutes here, 20 minutes there, half an hour. If you have a long chunk of time, right, if you are able to implement something more like a workday schedule where you have, let's call it 3 hours available to you to get your work done, the intervals can help you balance multiple classes. And so instead of letting one thing take up that entire 3 hours, you want to chunk it up between different things. Okay. And it might not be perfectly balanced where you work on everything for half an hour. It may be that one thing is more important, so that ends up taking up more time, but you don't want to ignore maybe some of the smaller things so that they're completely neglected. And so it can be sort of a process of just trying to balance work according to the time you spend on it, as opposed to the amount of work that you actually get done.